Ok, bueno, es un gusto para mí abrir este CLACIP con un amigo, con un mentor, como es Clive Wynne. En principio, bueno, contarles un poco acerca del CLACIP y de la ACP. Nosotros, la ACP se fundó en el año 2005, alrededor del año 2005, y bueno, la verdad que estoy muy contento de ver nuevas generaciones como Camila, como Carolina, como Marina, y bueno, todos ustedes que hacen que la ACP siga funcionando fundamentalmente, y la idea es seguir creciendo en este sentido con el principal objetivo, que es hacer una ciencia psicológica basada en la evidencia. Quiero agradecer al equipo organizador, a Sofía Donati, a Carolina Shimabukuro, a Camila, a Aileen y a todo el equipo de Neurotransmitiendo, que fue fundamental para hacer la difusión. A Manuel Correa Freistab, a Antonella y un montón de chicas que bueno, realmente se pusieron la organización al hombro. Bueno, voy a presentar a Clive. Bueno, Clive Wynne es un investigador británico-australiano especializado en la conducta de los perros y en los parientes cercanos a los perros, como por ejemplo los lobos. Tuve la suerte también, gracias a instancias del equipo dirigido por Mariana Ventosela, otra gran mentora mía, junto con Alba Mustaca, de visitarlo en la Universidad de Florida, y hemos ido a trabajar en Indiana con perros, perdón, con lobos, ¿sí? Lo cual es algo para mí único en mi vida. Bueno, él ha trabajado en Australia, estaba actualmente trabajando en Estados Unidos, en Arizona, y bueno, él nació y creció en Inglaterra, fundamentalmente. Ha estudiado la conducta de muchas especies, desde palomas hasta los caninos, que es lo que se va a basar la conferencia de hoy. Desde el año 2006 está trabajando con esta especie, y bueno, tiene distintos libros, como los que ven en pantalla, dedicados al estudio de los perros domésticos. Así que, bueno, Clive, it's all yours, Clive. You can start.
Okay. Well, I'm going to thank you, Angel, for that kind introduction. I'm just assuming that it was a kind introduction because I couldn't understand a word of it, although I recognized my own name. So I know you were talking about me. I just don't know what you were saying. But anyway, thank you for this opportunity to talk to the dog enthusiast psychologists of Argentina. On the one hand, I would so love to be actually with you and having a beer and a meal and really being able to talk. On the other hand, hey, it's great that we have this technology, you know? I mean, it is wonderful to be able to just pop into each other's rooms and communicate over these great distances in this way. So I want to talk to you today about this question, which is one of the key motivating questions that energizes me to study these animals, dogs. And the question is, what makes dogs special? What makes dogs special? Because this isn't just something that crazy people say. Dogs really are objectively and scientifically very special animals. Look at our planet. Look at our planet. On the surface of this planet, there are close to 1 billion dogs on the surface of this planet. They are, aside from ourselves, they are the most widespread and numerous large mammal. How do they do that? How do they achieve that? Especially when you consider that we are living through a period when animals are going extinct. Thousands of species are going extinct. And it's we human beings who are responsible for that. we are living through a period of unprecedented human-caused extinction. We are destroying the environment, the parts of the world that so many animals need for their lives to continue. So in a period of unprecedented human-caused extinctions, a very small number of species are not only surviving, but doing exceptionally well. Somehow, dogs have figured out how to connect their lives with our lives in a way which gives them tremendous success, tremendous success. So that's why I asked this question: what makes dogs special? What is the secret of dog success in this human-dominated world? And because I want to sell my book, you can see what I believe the answer is. The answer is, as my book says, at least in English, I presume the Spanish translation says the same thing. It's because dogs have an astonishing capacity to love. That's what ordinary lay people call it. They say, my dog loves me. And that's going to be my answer to this question. What is the secret of dog success? It's going to be that dogs have an amazing, unprecedented drive, desire, motivation to form strong emotional connections with members of another species, with us. Okay, and so the American edition came out over a year ago. I am told that the Spanish translation came out last month. I haven't actually seen it myself, but it is on the internet, so it must be true. So let's talk about what makes dogs special. And before we move on, I found this photograph of a much younger Angel with a much younger me. I think this is 10 years ago. I think this is 10 years ago now that you came up to Gainesville. This photograph is taken at a conference, and now I'm looking at, I couldn't remember where it was, but it must have been CO3. It must have been the wonderful comparative cognition conference, I think.
Yes, it was in Melbourne, in CO3.
Melbourne, Florida. Yeah. So yeah, that was when he was young and without worries and okay. But doing great work then as now. So I'm not the first scientist, the first psychologist to ask the question, what makes dogs special? As I'm sure you know, dogs have been a part of psychology, modern experimental psychology, pretty much since the beginning of modern experimental psychology in the late 19th century. Ivan Pavlov worked with dogs. So dogs are not new to psychology, but they were largely forgotten. In the middle and second half of the 20th century, dogs were largely forgotten by psychologists. And it was only at the very end of the 20th century, in the 1990s, that two guys, as I understand quite independently, started studying dog psychology. And they had a particular interest in this question: what is the secret of dogs' success? These two guys were Adam Miklosi at a university in Budapest, Hungary, and Brian Hare, he was a young guy at the time. He was at several different universities. He was in Germany. He is now at Duke University in North Carolina in the United States. These two guys, quite independently, came up with the idea that the secret of dog success in modern human lives, in the modern human-dominated world, is special skills in understanding people. What professional psychologists call human-like social cognitive skills, at least some elements of theory of mind, at least some level of understanding that other individuals have minds of their own, which has distinct, unique information in it. So Brian Hare and Adam Miklosi argued, and Brian Hare continues to argue, that dogs during the process of domestication, which is an evolutionary process, which started 15 to 20,000 years ago in the last ice age, all of our dogs are descended from wolves. 15 to 20,000 years ago, certain groups of wolves started adapting, evolving to live closer to human beings. And so they have been evolving, as I say, 15 to 20,000 years. And Brian Hare especially argued that during this evolutionary process of domestication, dogs acquired an ability to understand and react to human cognitions, social cognitions, in a way that no other animal can do. Now, I'm not going to give you the long lecture on all the different tests that have been carried out that claim to show special forms of human-like social cognition in dogs. This isn't that talk. I'm just going to share with you one experiment that talks to this issue. I've chosen that one experiment because it is by far the most widely used test that is supposed to show special human-like social cognition in dogs. It's been tried on many, many species, and it is extremely simple. And there is nothing better in science than simple tests. Simple tests are great. You can try this on your own dog after I've finished, and there's less possibility of confusion if our tests are simple. So here's this super simple test. All you need to do is point and see if your dog goes where you point. This image shows you Monique Udell, or at least Monique Udell's bottom half. One of my past students, now a professor at Oregon State University in the United States. She is simply pointing at a container on the ground, and out of shot, there is a dog who is going to be released, and we'll see if the dog goes to the location that Monique has pointed at. If you try this for yourselves on your own dog, you will most likely find that your dog will go where you point, especially if you have set things up so that your dog knows that there could be something interesting in this location where you're pointing. There could be a food treat in the location where you're pointing. Most pet dogs tested in this way do follow human pointing gestures. Now, that's only remarkable if other species do not follow human pointing gestures. Adam Miklosi and his students in Budapest, Hungary, they hand-reared wolves. Wolves, because all of our dogs are descended from wolves. If you want to argue that there's something special about dogs, you need to show that it doesn't already exist in wolves. So Adam Miklosi and his students in Budapest, Hungary, hand-reared some wolves, tried this test on their hand-reared wolves, and they reported the wolves would not follow a human pointing gesture. Brian Hare in Germany and in the United States tested hand-reared wolves and reported that they could not follow human pointing gestures. People don't believe me now because my position has changed and I've become so strongly associated with a certain position that people don't believe me when I say that when I first heard about this, oh goodness, now 20 years ago, when I first heard about this, I believed it. I thought this sounded okay. I could see how this could be the truth. I only changed my mind after Monique Udell and I have been working with dogs for a year or two. We were contacted by people working at Wolf Park in Indiana. Wolf Park in Indiana has been hand-rearing wolves since 1974. That's over 40 years, coming on for 50 years, that they have been hand-rearing wolves. And they are very, very good at rearing wolf pups so that they grow up to accept human beings as social companions. That's a very challenging thing to do. It's very difficult to raise wolves so that they accept humans as social companions. But the people at Wolf Park have been doing it for a long time, and they're very, very good at it. And they wrote to me because they had heard of the research from Hungary, Adam Miklosi, from Germany and the United States, Brian Hare. They had heard of this research, the research that said that wolves were not as good at following human actions as dogs are. They had heard of this research and they couldn't believe it. These people who work at Wolf Park, they spend all day, every day interacting with wolves. That's their professional work life. And then in the evening when they go home, most of them go home to pet dogs. They have dogs at home. So here you have a group of people who have more experience around wolves and around dogs than probably anybody else in the world. And they didn't think it was the case that the dogs were more sensitive to what people were doing than the wolves were. So they reached out to me and invited me and Monique Udell to come up to Wolf Park and to test their wolves and see if this was true. And so that's what we did. We went up and we repeated the experiment. This is Lindsay Meerkam, another of my past students now at Monmouth University in the United States. She's pointing at a container on the ground there at Wolf Park. And you can see it's cold at Wolf Park. And hey, you know what? Actually, the wolves are every bit as good at this as are the best performing dogs. And I'll also mention that you can easily find groups of dogs who are not very good at following pointing gestures. We tested dogs at a local animal shelter, and they were really bad at following human pointing gestures. So this following pointing gestures, which I'm just offering you as one easy to follow example of a test that claims to show that dogs have special skills in understanding people, claims to show that dogs possess unique human-like social cognitive skills. It's not true. It's not true that dogs have special cognitive skills, because wolves can be as good at this as dogs are if the wolf is carefully raised by human beings. So to cut a long story short, I don't think dogs have any special cognitive skills. I think it's true dogs, our dogs that live with us as our pets in our homes, sharing our lives, they are very sensitive to what we're doing, but that sensitivity comes from their conditions of life. It actually comes from basically conditioning. There's nothing in our dogs that Pavlov and B.F. Skinner plus Konrad Lorenz, because it's crucial that they are imprinted onto us at an early age, which of course is very easy to do with dogs, very difficult to do with wolves and other wild animals. Those three components, Pavlovian conditioning, operant conditioning, and ethological imprinting, that's what makes our dogs so sensitive to us. And if you were to take a wolf and put it through the same conditions, or for that matter, I don't think anybody's tested, but take a bear, I think you would find the same result. And we know you find the same result in wolves. Okay. So there came a point where I had convinced myself that there's nothing special about the cognition of dogs. And I was beginning to become known as the guy who says there's nothing special about the cognition of dogs. And at that point, a journalist came and visited me and interviewed me, a journalist who went on to write this book. He was traveling around the United States with his dog, Casey. And as he did this, he was talking to people about dogs and how dogs live with people in modern America, in the United States. And we had a nice chat. I thought we had a nice chat, and we had a coffee together. He seemed like a nice guy. And then when he wrote about me in his book, this is what he said. He said, this was when I was still at Florida, the University of Florida. He said, Florida's Canine Cognition and Behavior Lab was led at the time of my visit by psychologist Clive Wynne, a former pigeon researcher, considered by some to be the Debbie Downer of the canine cognition field. So I don't know how widespread the character Debbie Downer is. This just represents somebody who's always saying negative things. I'd become known as the person who was always saying negative things. And I thought, obviously I didn't get involved in this to become popular, but I also felt that I was becoming misunderstood, or at least, and it was my fault. I wasn't explaining myself. I was saying that a particular theory about what makes dogs special is wrong, but it wasn't my belief that dogs are not somehow special. And I could see that if I was saying, well, they're not special in this way, they don't have unique human-like social cognitive skills. If they're not special in that way, then clearly it's up to me to put forward an alternative theory. What is it then? If it's not that, what is it? that makes dogs special? What is it that explains their truly astonishing success in the human-dominated world? In other words, if it's not smarts that makes dogs special, what is it? And I know, because this isn't the first time I've told this story, I know when I tell this story that it seems too cute to be true, but you'll just have to believe me. This is honestly how the story developed for me. Now, when Angel came and visited me, and when Mariana Bentosela came and visited me 10 years ago, we didn't have a dog. We didn't have a dog in our family. But later, I guess probably 2 or 3 years later, we got a dog. I love dogs. I wanted to have a dog for a long time. We got a dog, and she's somewhere behind me in the darkness, resting now. This is her. We call her Zephos. We made up that name. And you know now that I don't think dogs have special cognitive skills, but even by the standards of dogs, Zephos is not an especially smart dog. She's not quick to learn things. She's not a smart dog. And yet, if you came and visited me, you would immediately identify her strongest personality trait. And that is that she is stunningly affectionate. She is extremely loving. If you came to my front door, she would be a little nervous of you for a moment, but then, and I find this in itself fascinating, she would watch you and I talking to each other and interacting socially, and she would read, this simple-minded animal would read our social interaction, would identify that I see you as a friend, and she would then see you as a friend too. And she would express her affection completely unreservedly. And then as we came inside and we sat down and we continued talking and maybe we have a drink, at some point, she would have had enough time talking to you, the visitor, and she would come back to me. And I think you would say that she loves me. You would see a strong, affectionate bond between us. So it sounds too cute to be true, but it was actually getting this dog that made me realize that actually the remarkable thing about dogs doesn't lie in the cognitive domain. It lies in the emotional, affectionate domain. And so I have this thought, but obviously I can't expect to be taken seriously in a scientific context if I start talking about love. We don't use love in our scientific publications, especially if, like me, you come from something of a behaviorist background. If I'm going to be taken seriously, I've got to find ways of measuring this thing that a layperson calls love. And as soon as I had that thought, I realized that I actually already knew part of the solution. And that comes from not Angel's visit to Florida, but I think the next year or maybe 2 years later, Mariana Bentosela came and visited with us in Florida. And the purpose of the visit was that she could learn things from us. But actually, we learned at least as much from her as she taught to us. And one thing we learned from her was this very simple test of affiliation, of social, affectionate connection. And again, simple tests are always the best. All you have to do for this test, and I'm assuming since I already know that some of you are Mariana's students, so you probably already know about this test. All you have to do is sit down and mark a 1 meter radius circle around the seat and measure how much time does the animal spend inside the circle. And so here I'm about to show you 2 videos that are going to run at the same time. On the left, you see a wolf, and on the right, you see a dog. The person sitting down on the left with the wolf is a person that wolf has known since it was 10 days old. That person helped to raise that animal. They have a relationship that goes back many years to when that wolf was very, very young. On the right, you see a person with her dog. I don't actually know who they are. the person and the dog. I just know that that person and that dog, they live together. That is pet and mistress, or whatever term you prefer. And we're just going to see what happens as the person sits passively. There is also an active condition, sits passively in this video. And we just measure, we give them 2 minutes together. What portion of that 2-minute interval does the animal spend inside the circle? I'm only showing you a familiar person. You can also do the test with an unfamiliar person. And I'm only showing you the passive condition. You do also ask the person to actively reach out to the animal and engage with the animal. Beautiful, simple test. And let's see what we find. So here we have the time, the 120 seconds, the 2-minute interval going up the graph. I think you can see if I point at it. Going up, you see the 120 seconds that make up a minute, and we're just going to compare the wolves and the dogs. The wolves, they're interested in their special person. They spend roughly a quarter of the interval inside the circle with this familiar person. This is averaging across the condition where the person is passive and the person is active. I'm just throwing that together for now. So the wolves, these are hand-reared wolves. They're interested in these people. But when you compare it to the dogs are off the scale. The dogs spend pretty much the whole time inside the circle with their person. So long as they've been at least briefly separated before you do this, a dog will spend 2 minutes inside the circle with its person. So you can see on this very, very simple test, you can see how the dogs show much greater affiliation connection to their person than the wolves show to their person. And I love this test. As I say, it's so simple, and simple tests are much easier to interpret than the many more complicated forms of test you could use for this. So this isn't the only test that you can use to measure how dogs love people, to measure the strength of affiliative bond between people and their dogs, but I'm only going to show you one because I want to be able to keep the story moving along. This is work that, yes, Mariana was involved in, and Monique Udell was involved in too. And it was around this time as well that a geneticist, a young geneticist, Bridget von Holt, published a paper where she did some kind of, geneticists, what they do is just magic to me. What Bridget von Holt and her collaborators did was they went through the dog genome one piece at a time, and they have a way of identifying pieces of the genetic code which show evidence of having recently undergone evolutionary selection. And in the case of the dog, what that means is that Bridget von Holt was identifying pieces of the dog genetic code which had changed during domestication. Recent evolution for dogs is domestication. Now, most of this paper was unbelievably boring, of no particular interest whatsoever. But there was one little piece in the paper where Bridget said that she had identified one part of the dog genome that had changed recently. And that part of the dog genome in human beings leads to a very rare syndrome called Williams-Buren syndrome. Williams-Buren syndrome has many impacts. It involves a total of 28 genes which are deleted. So it's a very big genetic insult. And people who have Williams-Buren syndrome, because so many genes are involved, there are a lot of impacts on these people. They have a rather strange facial structure. They have heart defects. They have intellectual disabilities. They have a lot of problems. But the most interesting thing about people with Williams syndrome is they are unbelievably friendly. The medical literature uses a term, exceptional gregariousness, which I think is kind of funny because it's just an attempt to form a medical sounding pair of long words that any ordinary person would just say, they are very loving. They are very loving. People with Williams syndrome are famous for being unbelievably loving and trusting. And I thought, hey, isn't that what I'm saying about the dogs? That they are exceptional for their loving natures. What happened next was that Monique Udell met Bridget von Holt at a conference, and they got to talking. And they said, hey, we should collaborate. I have behavioral measures of affection in dogs. You have a suggestion that there's a genetic change in dogs that might be related to affection. So what they did was we got together and we collaborated. And Monique did a number of behavioral tests, including the test I just showed you from Mariana, a number of behavioral tests of affection of dogs compared to wolves towards people. Monique then sent DNA samples, which is just a mouth swab. It's completely painless. Sent DNA samples to Bridget von Holt, and Bridget did a genetic analysis just of that zone of 28 genes that are involved in Williams syndrome. And then we look to connect the behavioral difference between dogs and wolves to any possible genetic difference in this area of 28 genes. And I think this is amazing. To me, this is amazing. We actually found 3 genes that mutated in the journey from wolf to dog that are responsible for this behavioral difference in the level of affection of wolves compared to dogs towards people. These genes have the catchy names WBSCR17, GTF2I, and GTF2IRD1. And I'll show you, I feel I ought to show pictures. It's really difficult to show pictures of genetics, but we can show a graph. So here is a graph along the x-axis. Along the bottom, you have the 28 genes that are involved in Williams syndrome in human beings, but we're looking now at the canine dog-wolf genome. And going up the graph, you have the strength of the relationship between those genes and the behavior that we're interested in. And so you can see that WBSCR17 and GTF2I pop out in this kind of graph. So this is so exciting to me because we know that if we're going to make a claim that dogs differ fundamentally from wolves, fundamentally, that has to be present in their genetic code. But it's also the case that it's extremely difficult to identify genes for behavior. It's extremely difficult for at least 2 reasons. One is that most behaviors are not controlled by single genes or small numbers of genes, the way hair color or eye color are controlled by small numbers of genes. Behaviors are usually influenced by large numbers of genes. Autism is a genetic disorder, but it's influenced by, I don't know how many, I believe dozens of different genes are implicated in autism, and different families, probably different genes. So it's very difficult to identify genes for behavior, first because a lot of genes are involved, and second, because most behaviors are not any kind of a direct readout of genes. They are greatly influenced by individual life experiences from the moment of conception right up until just a couple of moments before you carry out your behavioral test. Think about this. We're testing an animal's inclination to stay inside a 1 meter circle with a person. Well, obviously that's going to be influenced by everything about that animal's relationship with that person and with other people right up until the moment we carry out the test. If they had some kind of misunderstanding, if the person and the animal had a misunderstanding 20 minutes earlier and they had a fight about something, right, that's going to influence how much time the animal spends in the circle. Again, not like hair color, not like eye color, which are very little influenced by things that happen in your life. I mean, for as long as I have any hair and it has any color, it will be this color. I cannot make it change color by anything that happens to me. So it's very difficult, and it was a very long shot, and therefore especially satisfying that we were able to find 3 genes. And I should also mention 3 genes that are involved in the affection that dogs have for people. I should also mention that 2 of the genes, GTF2I and GTF2IRD1, have been shown in completely independent, unrelated experiments in mice. You know, in mice, you can add genes into mice and you can take genes out of mice. And so there have been direct genetic experiments on mice, and those two genes have been shown independently to make animals exceptionally friendly. So, so there's independent evidence for that there. Okay, so dogs have an exceptional capacity, drive, motivation to form strong emotional connections. We see that in their genes. This has also been shown by other scientists at other levels of a dog's biology. Researchers in Australia put heart rate monitors onto people and onto their dogs and just measured the heartbeats as the person and the dog settled down and relaxed together on a comfortable sofa. And they found that the heartbeats come into synchrony as they do that. It's very cute. Researchers in Japan and now other parts of the world have measured the levels of affiliative hormones. There's a hormone called oxytocin that people call the love hormone. And these researchers at Azabu University in Japan have shown that when people and their dogs look into each other's eyes, you actually get elevations in oxytocin on both sides of the partnership, which is what you also find in human beings within species, mothers and their infants, newly enamored couples, not old married couples, but newly enamored couples show the same thing. So that's very nice. Researchers at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, here in the United States, trained dogs to lie perfectly still in MRI scanners. Now, I don't know whether you've had an MRI scan. It's a stressful experience because the machine is very noisy. You have to lie down in this tube, which is rather claustrophobic. But if you do that, scientists can produce very detailed images of your brain while you are wide awake and can even see different locations of different levels of activity. This had only been done in our own species because only with human beings can you explain the importance of keeping perfectly still. And you can explain that although it will produce a certain amount of anxiety, there's not really anything to worry about. It's not dangerous to be in an MRI scanner. So only with humans had this been done before, but Gregory Burns and his collaborators trained dogs to lie perfectly still in these scanners. And that then meant that they were able to scan the dog's brain while they showed the dog signals that different things were about to happen. And they trained these dogs in the scanner that one signal, which was a toy, they would hold up one toy and it meant in a moment you will receive a piece of sausage. And they held up a different toy and that toy meant in a moment you will see your beloved human being. So they're offering the dog two different reinforcing outcomes, two different rewarding objects. Piece of sausage, which we all know dogs love sausages, or your human being. So they have two different signals, two different consequences, and they measure how much the caudate nucleus, which is the reward center in a mammal brain, how much the caudate nucleus is activated by these signals that predict different consequences. Then in a follow-up experiment, they let the same dogs make a free choice. They put in a big room, they put the dog's owner over here, and they put a bowl of dog food, sausages, over here. And the dog gets to choose. Do you want to choose your human or do you want to choose the sausage? So now they have two different ways of measuring the dog's enthusiasm and interest in their owner as a reinforcing consequence compared to sausages as a reinforcing consequence. What do they find? So on this graph, we're going to represent both outcomes at the same time. Going up the graph on the y-axis, we're going to show how much the dogs choose their person when they're given a free choice in a big room, person or sausage. And then going across the graph, we're going to show how much the caudate nucleus is activated for the person compared to the sausage. And what they found was that there's a very strong relationship between these two ways of measuring the dog's preference. The note here, where's the mouse? Here we are. Note that the 0 point is not actually in the middle because more of the dogs had more brain activity for the person than for the food. So the dogs overall have an average preference as a group for the person in preference to the sausage. In other words, your dog loves you more than your dog loves sausages. But furthermore, there's a very strong relationship between these two ways of measuring the preference. Dogs up here at the top right, they show a lot of brain activity for the person, and they actually choose the person when they're given a choice. And there are some dogs down here at the bottom left, like this poor sad dog, who always chose the sausage and never chose their human being. Well, they also showed a lot more brain activity for the sausage than they did for the human being. So I love this, how at multiple levels, we can see dogs' affection for people coming through at different levels of analysis. So I really like that. But I want to correct myself. All this time, apparently 38 minutes I've been talking to you. For 38 minutes, I've been saying that what makes dogs special is their capacity, drive to form strong emotional connections with people. Now, that is true. I believe that is true. But it isn't about us. It isn't the dogs are born, oh, where are the people? I need to find people. That's not how it works. Dogs, like all animals, are born not knowing what kinds of beings they should seek for their social relationships for the rest of their lives. Early in life, they go through the critical period for social imprinting that was identified by the Nazi Konrad Lorenz. They go through this period, and the things that they meet in that early period of life are the things they will seek out for social relationships for the rest of their lives. In dogs' lives, the dogs we know, the dogs we have met, all met people early in life, and so they seek people for those relationships. But it doesn't have to be people. It could be anything. It could be anything. And where you can see this if you visit ranchers who keep dogs to guard their livestock. I wanted to see this for myself to be able to write about it in my book. Here in Arizona, there are people who ranch goats in the desert or the near desert, the sort of semi-desert. There are ranchers who keep goats. And I went and visited some goat ranchers who have dogs who protect their goats. And this is a photograph of a goat mother and her kid sleeping on the body of a dog. And you can see, I think, just from looking at that photograph, you can see that they have a strong emotional bond. They have an affectionate relationship. How is that achieved? It's achieved simply by putting the dog puppy into the goat barn when it's a puppy and simply letting it grow up around goats. And that dog will become an adult who seeks out goats for affectionate bonds, just as we are accustomed to seeing our dogs seek out human beings for their affectionate bonds. And I'm only just reminded that Charles Darwin, when he went around the world, he saw this. This doesn't tend to happen in Britain. In the British Isles, livestock guarding animals are not something that you see because there are no predators left. There have not been predators in the British Isles for hundreds of years. So Darwin had never seen this. You know where he saw it? Where he, in his journal of the voyage of the Beagle, he saw it in Argentina, in the Pampas in Argentina. He saw this and he writes about it in his journal. So anyway, it's easiest to see it with ranchers, goats, sheep, sometimes cattle. Doesn't seem to be so common with cattle. So I have seen it myself with goats. The cutest example I have ever heard of comes from Australia, where there's an island with penguins on the island. And at certain times of year, the water goes out so far the foxes get onto the island and have repeatedly destroyed the penguin population. And a chicken rancher, a guy who had free-range chickens, he suggested they should get livestock guarding dogs to guard the penguins. And so that's what they do in Australia now. The penguins live on an island along with 3 or 4 dogs, and the dogs protect the penguins from the foxes. And since they started doing that, they've had no more trouble from foxes. So that's the cutest example I know of, but it's pretty unique. The penguin example is pretty unique, but goats and sheep are very, very commonly protected by dogs and have been for many thousands of years. Okay, so I'm saying that our dogs care about us. So let me share with you one of our more recent experiments where we explored how far does dogs caring for people go? What is a dog willing to do for a person that it cares about? And so we had people come into our lab and we asked them to climb into that box, that silver box at the end of the picture. There's a person inside that box, and this is her dog, and she is going to cry out for help from inside the box. And let's see what happens. I don't know whether you can hear the sound on this. Do you hear the sound? You do? So she's calling out, help, help me. And we measure the animal's behavior from the video. And we can see from a number of signs that the animal is quite distressed. We've designed the box to be very easy to open. That's very sweet. So the dog rescued the person. We have a control condition where the person is back inside the box, but now they just read calmly. And I'll just let you see the beginning so you can see that the dog is much more relaxed and really doesn't show any signs of distress, and ultimately just settles down to listen to the person reading. So I have to be careful not to exaggerate the results of this experiment. Most dogs do not open the box, but we have a control condition where we put food in the box and we let the dog see that we're putting food in the box. And what we find is most dogs are just not smart enough to open the box. But if they can understand what needs to be done, if they are smart enough to open the box, then they will open the box to free their human being when the human being's in distress. And they're more likely to do it when the human is in distress than they are if the human is just reading calmly. So what I conclude from this is that dogs will help their human if their human's in distress, if they can just understand what needs to be done. And I think people commonly overestimate the intelligence, the problem-solving abilities of dogs. Dogs are really not that great at problem-solving, at opening boxes. And so they often fail on this task. We can see that they're distressed. We can see that they're concerned, but they're not successful because they don't understand what needs to be done. So I think I'll stop there, right? Because I think that's the right time. I do have one other study I could share with you, but I think this is the right time to stop. Yes, Angel? Okay, all right. So I'm happy to take your questions, your comments. Yeah.
First of all, Clive, I want to thank you for being here and to remember good old times. It was really, really nice for me. Thank you for your conference. And I don't know if the people have some questions. I have one, but okay, we have some questions in the chat. I got one question only. I remember your two-stage hypothesis. Yeah, how do you relate these findings about affection with your hypothesis?
Right. So exactly, Angel. Monique and I had, when we were trying to explain why, how, when dogs or other animals successfully do things like following human pointing gestures and these other behaviors that show a great deal of sensitivity to human behavior, we said two things are necessary. The first thing is that the animal must be socially imprinted onto human beings at that critical period of early life, the critical period for social imprinting. That was part one. Otherwise, the animal is not in any kind of a relationship with the human being. It will not be paying attention to what people are doing. And then the second part is that during the animal's daily life, if the animal is going to pay attention to what people do, then the things people do have to have consequences for the animal. So the second part is simply conditioning, Pavlovian or operant conditioning. The things people do predict consequences that matter to the animal. And so if the animal is socially imprinted on people and the people are doing things that matter to the animal, which of course is so true of our pets who are completely dependent on us, then and only then the animal will attend to what people are doing. And it doesn't matter if it's a dog or a wolf or a bat or a bear, it will pay attention and follow human actions. So that was our explanation, which I still stand by, for why so many dogs pay attention to what people do and follow human pointing gestures and all the other things that have been reported. When it comes to dogs' affection for people, all that requires is that they be socially imprinted onto people during the critical period for social imprinting. That's the whole thing. The fact that dogs then express it so exaggeratedly, that they're so much more expressive of affection than are probably any other species, although it's not the case. It's not that many species that have been tested. All that depends on is the social imprinting. The social imprinting means dogs take people as social companions, and then they express this unbounded affection for people.
Carolina, Camila, do you have some questions in the chat?
Yes, there are some that are already in English. I don't know, Clive, if you prefer to read them or I read them aloud.
I could do. Hold on. If I get rid of the slideshows a bit.
And there is one in Spanish that I'll translate.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I can't do it. Okay, I can see the, yeah, right. Okay, I see the chat. So maybe I should start at the top. Let's see. Spanish, 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 Spanish. It's interesting that Federico thanked me for remembering Lorenz's awful history. It should not be forgotten. It's a complicated thing, right? I mean, there are two things that I talk about with him. One is social imprinting, and the other is Kindchenschema. They're both good ideas. I can't not talk about them. But every time I talk about them, I mention that he was a Nazi. Yeah, I think yeah, it was, I mean, hell, it was a very difficult time to live through. Yeah, but it's interesting. The three founders of ethology, Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Karl von Frisch. Nico Tinbergen was Dutch. Karl von Frisch, he was German, but he did not become a Nazi, and he had a very difficult time. He was a great risk at several points from the Nazis. Okay, Elizabeth Donahue, a nice family movie called Oddball, based on the story of the dogs. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's not accurate, and it's not. You have to have fairly small children to get much enjoyment out of it. But at least that. So it's interesting. The photograph I showed you of the dog with the penguin does not come from the researchers, the people doing the work. They do not seem to produce any photographs at all of a dog with a penguin. That photograph comes from the movie. So the movie is fantastic. It's for the beautiful landscape and the pictures of the animals. Okay, Mauricio, I'm not sure. I recently learned the so-called genetic toolbox genes, also recently canine behavior toolbox. Having genetics, something hard to study. What are the genetic toolbox? Yeah, I'm afraid I can't help you much there. The level at which I describe the genetics is the level at which I understand the genetics. I don't have any deeper understanding. I'm sure there are people listening in who understand the genetic side of it better than I do. All I can tell you is that we've found these 3 genes that are involved in social behavior and that are tied up with Williams syndrome. There is a group in Sweden, Per Jensen and Mia Persson. They have found genetic mutations in dogs in genes that are involved in autism. And I don't know exactly how that should be interpreted, but I think it's interesting that they have also found mutations in social genes, but I cannot help you much more with that. Mariana, hi Mariana. Hi, do you think dogs can have the same intensity bonds with other animals? Right, so it's very interesting you should ask that question, Mariana. Can dogs have the same intensity of bonds with other animals that they have with human beings? And there's something of a paradox here, right? So I talked about pet dogs. Primarily, I talked about pet dogs. But of course, the majority of dogs are not anybody's pet. When I said there could be 1 billion dogs on the surface of the planet, they're not all pets. They don't all live in people's homes. In fact, only a minority of them live in people's homes. Maybe 30 or 40% are pets living in homes. The majority of dogs live out on the street. They're not true wild animals. There are very, very few dogs living a long way away from people, but they're not living inside people's homes. And there are now studies from India, studies from Italy, of the social behavior, the social structure of those dogs. And what's really curious is that those dogs don't appear to have particularly strong social bonds. They appear to have really quite fluid relationships. They can have friendships, but they drift apart again. And so we have something of a paradox that we see dogs forming what appear to be strong bonds with people, but only weak bonds with their own species. And even in cases where 2 dogs live together as pets in the same household, there have been tests of the social bond between those 2 dogs, and they don't seem to be all that strong. So we have something of a paradox there, which we really need to develop a better understanding of. And my working hypothesis at the moment is that, and I have to use this word carefully. So I am going to use the word dominance, but I'm using the word dominance strictly in the sense that a behavioral biologist uses that term. I am not signing up for anything that, I don't know, I guess you've heard of the dog trainer Cesar Millan, who has a popular television show. I'm not buying into any of the nonsense that he says. I'm not using the term the way that lay people use it or the way that some popular dog trainers use it. I am strictly using the term dominance in the sense that a behavioral biologist uses it, that one individual in a social group has more control of resources and that makes an individual dominant, and another subordinate individual has less control of resources. So I am going to suggest that it is dominance relationships make dogs have such strong bonds with humans, because humans are, in this technical sense, dominant because we control all the resources. And that prompts the dog to look to us and to follow us to a stronger degree than a dog would follow another dog. Because, hey, if you have 2 pet dogs that live together with you, they cannot have much dominance because you control all the resources. So they are both subordinate to you. And I think that might be part of how to explain the paradox that dogs have weak social relationships to each other and yet strong social bonds to human beings. And I think that could be the part of the explanation. That's a really interesting question. Andres asks, is there any genetic correlation between social intelligence and individual intelligence for problem solving by dogs? And all I can say is at this point, we don't know. This genetic work on social intelligence is very new. If I were going to, I don't know off the top of my head, but the place I would go to look would be perhaps the Swedish researcher Svartberg, who was able to look at data from tens of thousands of dogs. But I don't think there were tens of thousands of dogs on an assessment, a sort of personality assessment, but I don't think there was much social testing in there. So I don't think anybody's looked at that. I could be wrong, but I don't think anybody's looked at that. Juan Manuel asks, is there any behavior that indicates the beginning of a relationship between dog and human? Why the relation is done? So I actually don't think that a relationship, a social bond, was part of the origin of dogs. We don't know, but I think that when dogs first came into being 15 to 20,000 years ago, they came into being because some of our ancestors became settled. They were still hunting and gathering. This is long before agriculture. Long before agriculture, some people became settled. And when people become settled, they create trash. They create rubbish. And that trash attracts animals to it. It may be no use to us, but it is still useful for some other species. There is value in our trash. I don't know what it's like in Argentina. Here in the United States, cities all around the country, as in Europe, spend a lot of money to keep animals out of the trash. We have fences, we have all sorts of things to keep animals out of the trash. But I know in many other parts of the world, I've seen this in Central America, I know this is the case in India and elsewhere in Asia, in Africa, they don't have the resources to keep animals out of the trash. Lots of animals come in. So I think the first phase of dog domestication was just groups of wolves coming in and foraging on human trash. And I think that there was natural selection among the wolves that foraged on human trash to become less effective at hunting live prey and more effective at scavenging from human trash. But I don't think there was a social relationship at that stage. I think at most there was mutual tolerance. I think people found this new kind of maybe smaller, maybe less powerful wolf easier to tolerate than the standard wolves that are big and scary and dangerous, would easily eat your children. So I think the only relationship in the first 5,000 years was tolerance. But then the Ice Age came to an end. The Ice Age came to an end and the planet warmed up. I always thought this sounded like a good thing. When I was a kid and I first learned about the Ice Age sounded bad, and the modern period, warmer, sounded good. I didn't like the idea of an Ice Age. But it's interesting to think that our ancestors had lived in an icy planet for hundreds of thousands of years, and they knew how to be successful in that cold environment. And they were successful hunters. Cold environments tend to be open environments. You have very open forests in cold climates, and you have areas where there's just really very little growing. You have tundra and steppe climates, environments. In those open environments, our ancestors were able to hunt very effectively because we have excellent vision, and vision works very well in open environments. As the climate warmed up, the planet gets warmer, forests grow where there were no forests, and the forests that are there become much thicker. And temperate forests, tropical forests are very thick. Now our ancestors are confronted by a major problem. If you go out into a thick, warm climate forest, you cannot see very much because there's so much growing vision is very limited. And if you do see something, you can't get to it. You can't move quickly through a warm forest. And I think it's at that point that our ancestors and our dogs' ancestors formed a partnership, because dogs can rely on smell. Smell works just fine. It doesn't matter whether you can see or not. The smell still comes through. Dogs can hunt with smell, and they can move quickly through these dense environments that humans can only move through slowly. And I think it's at that point that humans and dogs formed a partnership. And that would be my guess for when these genetic changes took place that made dogs more affectionate, because a strong emotional connection is really useful if you're going to do something difficult together, right? I mean, when do you form your strongest emotional bonds? You form them when you're working together with other people or with your dog on something difficult and challenging. So that's my guess. That's my guess. Now, there are now archaeogeneticists, right? There are people who get genetic material from archaeological remains. And there's a guy at the University of Oxford, Gregor Larson, who is an archaeogeneticist. And he has some samples, and he is going to look for these Williams syndrome genes that we have identified. And so I hope within a couple of years, we will know when those mutations took place. But right now, all we can do is speculate. Okay, Antonella asks, does the breed of the dog change the result of the research, the way they solve problems, the results of genetic evolution? The short answer, Antonella, is less than you think. The differences within breeds in problem solving many aspects of behavior, the differences within breeds are at least as big as the differences between breeds if you ignore that small number of behaviors that are special to certain breeds. So if you want to go hunting with a gun and have a dog that retrieves the birds that you shoot, you need a retriever. Retrievers retrieve. If you want to go hunting and you want a dog that points to where it sees prey, you need a pointer. Only pointers point. Retrievers retrieve, pointers point, herders herd. There are a limited set of behaviors that are special to certain breeds. But if you move away from those specific behaviors and you talk more generally about problem solving or whatever, at this state of our knowledge, the differences do not appear to be as great as is usually assumed. Okay. They follow people that control the resources, just like humans do, Juan Manuel says. Yeah, well, that's that's certainly true. That's smart, right? Okay, Mauricio says, as I carefully listened to your talk, it came to my mind that wolves and dogs' imprinting periods are quite different. Dogs are longer. So would you say this is one of the actual things that makes dogs really different? Yes, absolutely, Mauricio. Absolutely. So I didn't emphasize that in this talk. But wolves, the critical period for social imprinting is, nobody's actually done a proper experiment, but it's widely believed that the critical period for social imprinting in wolves, as in other wild animals, is just a couple of weeks. And it's very early in life when the animal can hardly move, can hardly see, can hardly hear, can hardly smell. Smell probably more than the others. And that more or less guarantees that unless people step in and do something really remarkable, unless people step in, wolves grow up only forming social relationships with wolves. And that's true of all wild animals. And it has to be, right? Anything else for a wild animal would be disastrous because, you know, I mean, we tell our children these stories about how all the animals in the forest, they're all friends or whatever, or maybe almost all of them are friends, but there's one bad guy. But that's not true. We know that cannot be true. Predator animals cannot be making friends with their prey. Prey animals cannot be making friends with predators. They would not survive. That's nonsense, right? But dogs are different. Dogs are different. The critical period for social imprinting in dogs is at least 10 weeks, and it might be longer than that. It might be longer than that. I don't really understand why, because it's such an important question, but it was only ever studied properly once in the 1960s, and nobody has ever been back to it since then. But we really would do well to know with more precision about the critical period for social imprinting. I don't know whether it's because it was one of the Nazi Konrad Lorenz's ideas, and we don't like to talk about the ideas of people who were like that. Maybe that steers us away, or maybe it's just fashions. Science, like any other human activity, has fashions, and social imprinting is just not fashionable at the moment. Okay, hold on. So do I agree with Coppinger? Andres asks, do I agree with Coppinger's theory about mixed dog auto domestication and human drive dog domestication? I'm not quite sure I understand the question as it's written, but certainly I agree with Coppinger. Coppinger was right, I think, that dogs domesticated themselves. I mean, that's a phrase I don't like the sound of. I would rather just say that early domestication was natural selection. It was natural selection of a group of wolves that adapted to a change in the world that humans created. It was natural selection, adaptation to a human changed environment. That was the beginning of domestication. Coppinger was wrong to place that after the end of the Ice Age and at the same time as the origin of agriculture. That was clearly a mistake. I mean, he was working from the best available knowledge of the time. The guy's been dead now for 4 or 5 years. And there has been a lot of controversy about when did dogs come into being, but it is abundantly clear now that it was at least 14,500 years ago, probably somewhere in the range, 15 to 20,000 years ago. Thank you, thank
Clive,
you, thank you.
Clive,
Yes.
if you want, we can do 1 or 2 more questions, and so we can let you go. Okay.
Okay. Well, so I'm happy to answer a couple more questions. I think I answered all the questions that were in English, but if somebody would translate 1 or 2 of the Spanish questions for me, I'd be very happy.
The question that was in Spanish was then in English. The same person put it in English. So
that's
great.
I
have a question now that I'm speaking.
Okay.
Maybe it's too broad. If you think it's too broad, don't answer. But in what direction do you think dog cognition research is going? Because now we are delving into genetics, delving into imaging. Well, you're an expert, so I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
So I am excited that the field of dog cognition and behavior research is growing so much, but I am a little bit worried that I think some of this research is being done just because dogs are cheap and easy to do research on. And so I see papers that I think are motivated by human questions. They're anthropomorphically motivated studies. I have little interest in any more studies that want to try and tell me that dogs do something that only people and dogs can do, because I just don't think that's true, and I'm just not interested. On the other hand, I think when you start asking yourself about how is it possible, there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of really big gaps. Like I was saying, it seems astonishing to me that we haven't gone back to investigate social imprinting since the 1960s, when it's supposed to be, and I told you the standard line. The standard line is it's a critical period for social imprinting. And yet you meet people, and I think my own dog is one of these. They adopt an adult dog that did not live with a house with cats before it came in with them. But the dog is a year old, 2 years old. You bring it into home, there's a cat, and gradually the dog and the cat seem to become friends. That's not supposed to be possible. It's not supposed to be possible for an animal that's past the critical period for social imprinting to form a social connection to a member of a species it did not meet during that critical period. And yet, when you talk to people, it seems like it happens. why aren't we studying that? Because that would be a very interesting observation. If it's true that dogs form social relationships with individuals from species they didn't meet when they were young, that would be a true exceptional case for dogs. And yet nobody looks at social imprinting. I mentioned my thinking about dominance. Dominance is a total taboo. You know, John Bradshaw in England has published a book and articles saying, no, there's no such thing as dominance for dogs. Well, hey, that would be really weird. Most social animals experience dominance, right? There are not very many social species that do not have dominance. There are a few, but they're not very many. And everything says that when dogs are in groups with other dogs, they experience dominance. In fact, there are studies from Germany, this woman called Feddersen-Pedersen. Feddersen-Pedersen did a study in the 1970s where she put dog pups in a pen, in a space, with wolf pups, dog pups and wolf pups together. And you know what? These were poodles. The dog pups were massively dominant over the wolf pups. And there are these photographs of these little poodles expressing dominance over the wolves. Well, I think we have to understand what's going on in dog dominance because, yeah, it's enormously important. So I worry that there are too many of these studies. I mean, this isn't a scientific study, but have you seen on social media the dogs that have been trained to press buttons, and when they press a button, it says a word? Have you seen this? And everybody's getting so excited about this. This is not, forget all that stuff. We don't need any more anthropomorphic cognitive research. We need to actually go back to really basic behavioral processes from conditioning on the one hand and from ethology, basic behavioral biology. We need to understand dogs' social natures at a much more basic level.
So Clive, all the people is thanking to you for sharing your knowledge. So I hope that to see you soon.
Yeah.
So you can visit in Sudamérica, to visit
Yeah.
in Buenos Aires. Quiero agradecer a toda la gente que participó de distintos lugares sobre todo de Latinoamérica, estoy viendo. Así que, bueno, estamos en contacto. Y Clive, do you want to share your website?
Sure. My website is just clivewynne.com. I could put that. I really need to find a way to bring it up to date.
A ver.
Yeah.
There. Excellent. So we will keep in touch, Clive. Thank you very much. It's an honor for us to have you here. And saludos a todos y estamos en contacto. Mañana a las 2 de la tarde hay otro evento de psicología cognitiva a través de este mismo Zoom. Estamos en contacto. Thank you, Clive. See you soon. All the best.
Thank you. It was fun. We'll meet again. We'll have a beer together. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.